This is George Solis. First of all, congrats to my boss brothers on their 100th episode, and cheers to Nick in particular. I wish you only the best for whatever projects you decide to pursue in the future. I decided to read a quote from The Periodic Table by Primo Levi. It's a bit lengthy, but bear with me, please. It begins, "The number of atoms is so great that one could always be found whose story coincides with any capriciously invented story. I could recount an endless number of stories about carbon atoms that become colors or perfumes and flowers, of others which, from tiny algae to small crustaceans to fish, gradually return as carbon dioxide to the waters of the sea, in a perpetual frightening round dance of life and death, in which every devourer is immediately devoured, of others which instead attain a decorous semi-eternity in the yellowed pages of some archival document, or the canvas of a famous painter, or those to which fell the privilege of forming part of a grain of pollen and left their fossil imprint in the rocks for our curiosity, of others still that descended to become part of the mysterious shape messengers of the human seed and participated in the subtle process of division, duplication, and fusion from which each of us is born. Instead, I will tell just one more story, the most secret. Thank you."
Welcome to the Books of Some Substance podcast. This, you may have noticed, is episode 100. So we're doing things a little bit different this time. We're not talking about a book. We're actually talking about ourselves.
And we just lost listeners.
Which is what everybody's been asking for. They're like, what about you?
Just hordes of rabid fans begging for information.
Begging for information. So we put out a call. Literally, we put out a telephone number and asked all of you to call in with your questions, comments, quotes, takeaways, learnings from 100 episodes of the Books of Some Substance podcast. And thank you to everybody who called in. We got some wonderful comments and questions, and we appreciate it. So let's jump into it. Shall we?
Yes, we shall.
Hey, it's Pops calling to record my favorite quote from War and Peace. It's in the epilogue, part 1, chapter 8. You ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
"He was putting together what he called a serious library, and he made it a matter of principle to read every book he bought."
So I'm like 99.9% sure that's my dad, and that it's some sort of dig because I have a serious library and I have not read all the books in it. So thanks, Dad. Just knocking me down a notch once again.
Isn't that just like a father to celebrate you and also ridicule you at the same time?
If you had read all of your books, though, I mean, what's next once you've read all of your books? Isn't it always that potential, that book that's like always sitting there and it will someday make it onto the list to finish that book?
I mean, aside from like the number of books out there, right? I'm curious what your guys' intake
There's at least
is.
12.
There's at least 12 that I haven't read. But I feel like I always sort of get into something, read 2 or 3 of it, whether it's author or category, and then end up with like 6 or 7 of the books. And then by the time I've acquired those, I get into the next thing. So I feel like I'm making like 60% headway, but that it's like never converging. And that's my problem.
Well, I only read what you tell me to read, Nick, so.
So now what, Nathan? You're just going to be lost in the dark, man. Wandering.
Now we have ChatGPT.
Yeah.
That's the real reason I'm leaving. It's been replaced. Next question.
I'm gonna have to text Nick. Nick, what are you reading right now?
The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, I think.
That's accurate. It is a historical journey that I highly recommend. That does not fit into this podcast.
David, what about you? How do you choose your books and read them?
Oh, choose. It's pretty random nowadays and far and fewer between. I used to buy more books, I would say, but when you keep moving to new states and new countries over and over again, you just keep throwing books away. I mean, not literally throwing them away, but getting rid of old books,
Just
books
burning them.
You're burning. You're
yeah, I
book
just
burning.
burn them.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, they're personally banned, and then I have a bonfire. Yeah, so I try to keep the things that like I think I'm gonna reread if it's something I really love, and then if it's a book I haven't read yet, it's like, okay, I think this is something I would dig and I would like, so I'm gonna keep it. And then of course I regret it a year later. I'm like, didn't I own that? Shit.
So David, you're a bookshelf purger.
Yeah, I purge.
And Nick, do you purge these books that you don't read, or you just keep
Almost
building
never.
stacks?
Although I have gotten more comfortable with giving books to people, knowing that I'm never going to see them again.
The people?
Yeah, I did that like a week ago, and that used to stress me out. I used to put in some sort of like underhanded comment about how like, hey, I do really want this back, but I realize that doesn't matter. You're letting go of it at that point, with the hope that it's inspiring someone else. And I've gotten more comfortable with releasing one from the litter.
But only if you're breaking up friends with this person.
If I'm, oh yeah, no, I never talked to him again.
Yeah, not until the book is returned.
Exactly. David purges books. I purge friends, based on books.
I just buy books for the object. I don't even like intend to read it. There's no intention. I have a book that's wrapped in plastic, and I think every once in a while, I think I should open that book up, but then it would disturb how perfect it is wrapped in plastic.
Do you have your books organized according to color?
What if I said yes?
I mean, another reason I'm leaving this podcast.
Ouch.
Wait, are they? Sorry, that was just like
They are.
Oh, that's amazing.
They are.
It
goes white, cream, gray, kind of a pale blue, gray to yellow to orange, red, blue, black.
There was just a thing.
So your bookshelf looks like a really bad Rothko painting.
Yeah, it's more of a pop art thing. But
It's
like
more
at some point, like 10
rainbow
years
that's
ago,
mostly white and black.
like,
Okay.
did you do that independently? Because I feel like I started going to people's houses and they were all organized according to color, and I'm like, we have a system. We have a way to organize.
Are you asking if this was my original idea?
Like, are you
or
the
did I
first
copy
person
someone?
in the planet that organized them according to color, and everyone else followed you?
No, I went to Target and I was like, oh, that's cool how they arrange these fake books according to color. And then I came home and took a weekend to take all of my books off my shelf and put them in an order where I'll never find what I'm looking for ever again.
Man, that would drive me insane. Because anytime I bought a new book, I'm like, you know what? I really want to read this, but the color scheme is just, it's not going to work.
No, I love it. I just bought a stack of books. I went to a used book sale. And okay, clarification for all of our listeners. A lot of my books are like design books, art books. So
you don't need to find them ever?
Well, they're visual books, I mean. So the color of the cover is often easier to reference. I might remember what the cover looks like more than what the book is called or whatever. So there is some sense to it. But I went to a used bookstore or used book sale and bought a stack of books. But I can't just put them on my bookshelf. I'd have to rearrange the whole thing.
Mm.
Yeah, that's psychotic behavior.
So there are downsides, but I like looking at it, and that's mostly what I do.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can all agree on that. There's really no need to have a shitload of books. It's for yourself. It's nice to look at.
I was watching Seinfeld.
Oh yeah, and he tells George like, "What? You read it,
What's
right?
the deal with
What do
these
you
books?
need it for?"
Yeah, why do you need the book? You read it.
Yeah, it's
All right.
for aesthetic background purposes.
You know what I just learned? Here's a tip for everybody working from home. Books in your background make you more trustworthy.
Get you
scientifically verified. Or plants. Plants come in number 2.
You know what's also a great way to make yourself trustworthy? Is just like doing your job well.
Not anymore. Come on.
How do you even... All right.
What is well? What is
work?
job? What are we doing here? Maybe it's time for that next question.
Okay, let's move on.
Hello, my name is Anna, and I have some questions for you all. My first question is, have you ever felt a deep void upon finishing a book, essentially some sort of depression? Why? And tell us all about it. And what book would you read 1,000 times? My last question is, what novel?
It cuts off. Last question is what novel? You can interpret that how you will. So we got 3 questions. Have you ever felt a deep void upon finishing a book? What book would you read 1,000 times? And what novel?
Okay, I'll take the first one. So I was just going to answer this in a general author sense, not necessarily specific book, but that's basically every Krasnohorkai book is the deep void. I feel like that is just, you're so deep in it and it's so bleakly humorous and dark, but also unforgiving. And then you get to the end and you're just left with probably the truth is what I would say. That's what life is. And so I had this feeling just recently reading his last big one, the Baron Homecoming book. And
yeah,
that one doesn't leave you feeling good, but it is hilarious. So
yes,
I would say he is currently the master of the deep void, and I'm down with it.
I would say that happens a lot with Krasnohorkai. I would say there was a different kind of void feeling after finishing Proust and not having more Proust to read. That was a weird one because it took up like 6 months of life, maybe longer. And so
I think it was a year that we spent
reading and thinking about and talking about Proust. And so when that was over, it felt a little strange, but it was not long lasting because it was not an existential feeling. It was like, oh, I don't have this habit that I developed. Sometimes a Borges story will make me feel a weird sort of emptiness because I'll get trapped in a thought of infinity or thoughts on the impossibility of free will or something. And I'll feel like, oh, well, shit. What is this? But yeah, I'd say that those are the 3 that popped in my head. Nathan?
I would say War and Peace probably gave me that feeling. And it's more just, it's such a soap opera. You get used to like following these people's lives. He does such an amazing job of making these people feel real. And then the book's over and you don't have these people's lives to interact with anymore. After we read War and Peace, I immediately watched the BBC miniseries so I could get back into it because I was feeling withdrawal.
That's funny because I think that's the book that I would maybe read 1,000 times. I constantly think about rereading it.
But could you read it 1,000 times?
Probably not. I don't know if I'd be able to read anything 1,000 times.
Yeah, what's the objective? Is it reading a book 1,000 times? Is it just capability? It's like a marathon. And in which case I choose a very, very short book.
Yeah, so just some back of the envelope. If you were to read War and Peace in 2 months, which is a pretty good clip, you could read it 6 times a year. So you only need 166.67 years to hit 1,000.
So that's a bad choice, David.
I'm going to call you a liar.
Hopefully I live that long and am cognizant enough to read in my old age.
200th year.
In your 165th birthday.
Well, once I get downloaded to the Matrix or whatever the fuck happens in the future, then why not?
You can read them all 1,000 times.
Yeah.
It's true.
Won't that be grand? Just not dying, going on forever.
Reading Good forever Lord. In the infinite library. Nick, realistically?
Realistically.
So you're taking my approach on this. So what am I going to
realistically,
read
which
times?
book would you read 1,000 times?
So where my head initially went, and I think we're a little skewed because a lot of the books we think the most about are ones we've recorded on. So it went to War and Peace and Proust. Because I was just like, well, these are books that have so much depth that when you're finished, you've kind of forgotten stuff at the beginning. So that makes sense. Just keep rereading them to try to get to that level of depth. But maybe it's the opposite, where we find depth in anything. So the shorter, more compact thing is actually the thing that you could read 1,000 times and find a similar level of depth. You just think that it isn't there because it's so short.
So you're going with the Jughead Comics Almanac.
I'm doing first sentence of Finnegan's Wake because that's all you need.
Which is also the last.
All right, Nathan.
Well said, Nick. I think that I would go with something. I mean, like, yeah, I agree. Proust. I can't even fathom reading Proust 1,000 times. I could read it twice or 3 times, maybe. But maybe Siddhartha. Maybe that would be the book.
Oh, yeah.
It's just a simple nugget of wisdom. It's a book that you feel like you can read repeatedly. I've read it 2 or 3 times. And each time I've read it, it's like reading a different book because it's at a different time in life. All right, moving on.
Hey guys, this is Kit from Bloomington, Indiana. Big fan of the show. Nathan, Nick, David, I am calling to ask each of you, what is your favorite bathroom scene in all of world literature? Nathan, I know you especially should be up for answering this one. All right, congrats on the 100th episode. Take care, guys.
So I feel like my name was mentioned, so like in presidential debates, I have to respond. Kit, I don't know if you're thinking of something specific, so we can catch up on that later. But my personal favorite bathroom scene in world literature doesn't occur in a bathroom, actually. I think it occurs in a bed in a hotel room in Proust somewhere.
And a wardrobe.
The wardrobe, and she and in the taxi. I think she also poops in the taxi.
There's a taxi, yeah.
And just for those of you who maybe don't recall this scene in Proust, it's late at night, and he's riding the elevator back up to his hotel room and having a conversation with the bellhop. And the bellhop is talking about how wonderful his sister is and how she's really winning in life and how funny it is that she leaves her poop everywhere.
Well, it's not like she places it somewhere. She literally defecates in random strange places.
I don't remember.
Right?
I don't remember why.
You just thought it was funny. It was like a power move.
Yeah.
It's like that Always Sunny in Philadelphia episode. It was a Proust reference.
You might have to break that one down for me.
Too lowbrow for the literature podcast. That's fine.
I just haven't seen the show.
There's basically a whole episode where they just try to figure out who pooped the bed. That's all. And that's basically also a scene in Proust. So my point is...
Let's take this even lower brow. The Johnny Depp...
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah.
What was her name?
Amber Heard.
Amber Heard trial.
Oh, I don't know this.
There was the whole episode about her pooping in the bed to get revenge.
Yeah.
I guess it really is a power move.
That's the point. That's what literature speaks to real life, not the other way around.
So have you ever made that power move?
No.
I'm making it right now.
It wasn't until now that I realized it is a power move.
Yeah. Has your dog ever made that power move?
All the time. It's very powerful. Okay, can I go?
Yeah, please.
As
long as it's number 2.
I'm worried. Well, this is the number 2 answer, but I am worried that David and I might have the same answer. So I wanted to go first.
Maybe. Is it from
Tropic of Cancer?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay. Basically, Tropic of Cancer, which I read probably 15 to 20 years ago. And I would say it's early. I would say slightly formative in both like the writing style, but also just the level of offensiveness. And I understand that book is often popular with younger people who are kind of like feeling both the artisticness of it and the fact that, books can be highly revered, but also have this kind of content in them. So at some point they're visiting prostitutes and one guy goes number 2 in the bidet and then they all freak out about it. They're like, you shit in the bidet. So like that, I guess, book was formative. So that was a formative bathroom scene in a formative book for me.
I would say for me, it was probably one of the first times I think I read a bathroom scene in a book. And it was also considered at the time of its publication sort of revolutionary in the fact that you actually see people just using the bathroom. And it's in James Joyce's Ulysses. Early in the book, I think it's like chapter 3 or 4, Bloom goes to the outhouse and he's sort of reflecting on his love and taking a dump at the same time. So Joyce had no problem going really lowbrow in his work of unbelievable literary achievement.
Yeah.
And so that combination was just so interesting, and it was very memorable in my mind. I still remember. And I think at one point he wipes his ass with like a prize-winning short story from a literary magazine or something. Um, so yeah, that one comes to mind. You mentioned Henry Miller. There's a documentary. I think it might be on YouTube somewhere, and it's him standing in his bathroom talking about his bathroom, because when people come to visit him, his bathroom, like, people love to just like spend time in there because he's got like all these wild pictures and posters and quotations up on the wall. And he talks about how bathrooms are very a good place in a very classic middle-aged man sort of way, get thinking done.
How much of literature do you think? How many breakthroughs do you think happened on the toilet?
Quite a few. In the shower is another one. People talk about how having water on them like helps open up their mind and clear their mind quite a
Well,
lot.
it's also the last refuge from the smartphone.
Is it you don't use your phone in the bathroom?
No, in the shower specifically.
Oh, you don't use your phone in the shower? What kind of Luddite are you?
Yeah, I got that waterproof case. Yeah. Yeah, it's probably the last thing that people aren't carrying it with them.
So I'm calling in to say thank you all for the effort that you put into this podcast. I remember starting to listen to it, I think it's like 6 years ago now, and it felt like I was listening in on a conversation between friends. So it was very comfortable to listen to, and I remember laughing. There was one episode in particular more recently, maybe a couple years ago or last year, that I was just laughing because of something I think Nathan had said, and maybe Nick made a comment about how Nathan said it, and it was great. I've really enjoyed these episodes and hearing about books that I honestly don't read or wouldn't read on my own. So thank you all for what you do and what you've done with it. I do have a couple questions. So how has your approach to reading books changed since doing the podcast? And then my other question is, what book takes you back to your childhood and why? I would love to hear about both of those. All right. Thank you. Bye.
So thank you for calling in. And I want to know what it is that Nick was making fun of me for.
I don't think she said making fun of. Just the way that you said it elicited
I think that's
a
what she was
response
implying
from me. I don't think we know. I would never make fun of
I
you,
think we
Nathan.
know.
Let's start with question number one. How has your your approach to reading changed, or has your approach to reading changed? And if so, how has it in the last? How long have we been doing this podcast? Like almost
I think it's
a
8.
decade, yeah. 8 years. In the last 8 years. I'll say now I read thinking about what Nick's going to make fun of me for when I say it.
In a negative way, more frantically to try to finish something sometimes. Like, oh shit, we need to record this. Fuck. I think I read better books than I would otherwise, and get a chance to read things that I maybe put off. Like, oh, I'll read that eventually. Like, I don't think I would have read Proust or War and Peace or a second Ursula K. Le Guin book if it wasn't for this podcast. So those have all been experiences, some good, some bad. It's not really about an approach to reading, more the opportunity to read.
Nick, have you experienced any evolution in your reading habits?
Yeah, so this experience reminds me of a prior experience I had where in the glory days of the aughts and into the early teens, I think that's how we refer to them now, I used to review a lot of records. So I'd have people send me records, I'd post them online, and it was before everything was just for free everywhere, and it felt like it mattered. And obviously like a tiny niche of whatever underground music that nobody gives a shit about. But it, exposed me to a lot of stuff that maybe I wouldn't seek out specifically. And I think with Boss, I mean, that's the big thing, is part of it is forcing ourselves to go after stuff that you've heard of or people talk about or you feel like you should get into, but you haven't had the time to. So, I mean, that's a huge positive because it's basically a forcing function for that. The second piece of that is, when you have to produce something from your action of reading, or in this analogy, listening to a record, you definitely do pay attention more, and you're always processing information through a funnel of how does this fit into my collective observations or understanding of this as a whole, which I also love. But the flip side of that is that it also becomes a little bit of a set of walls around you. And I will say personally, I'm looking to get a tiny bit outside those walls, at least for a chunk of time, because it's also cool just to listen to shit and know that you don't have to have an opinion about it, and also read a thing and know that you don't have to have an opinion about it. So I will say I've thought a ton about that specific question, like in advance, because there's a lot of pros, but at the same time, knowing that like, if I'm kind of tired one day and I'm reading a chunk of this book, but I'm still enjoying it, that's totally fine. I don't have to remember this chunk of the narrative or this chunk of the, aesthetic in order to turn it into a comment or a thought later for this thing that we're making. So I will say it's kind of freeing to not have to always be funneling everything through that lens all the time. Because it's basically gotten to the point where I think 9 out of 10 books I read are all related to Boss somehow. Because as David noted, it's always the time crunch. So yeah, definitely positives, but there's kind of always a flip side to stuff I have found.
Yeah, I would kind of echo what you're saying. Like, it's doing the podcast has made me a much more active reader. Like, now I feel, because of these conversations and because the book doesn't end when I put it down. And that's what I really like about this. Like, the reading activity continues after that. It continues in the conversations. And so as a reader, I'm reading it also as the person who's going to talk about it. And it's just, I don't know exactly how that changes things. It's just, I'm not simply consuming the book. I'm maybe being a little bit more critical, not in the sort of, looking down on it or whatever, but just being more active in the reading process.
More like engaged in what the book's trying to do and like trying to say. Like, what do you mean?
Well,
by
critical? Just very specifically highlighting and tabbing things, because I'm like, oh, that's something I want to come back to. That's a point that resonates with me. Like, it's not, because it's very easy, I think, to read a book. It's very easy for me to read a book, and without actively engaging with it, there may be a passage or two that speak to me, but by the time I move to the next chapter, I don't remember what that passage was. It's like gone. It's maybe soaked into me somewhere, but it's not, I don't remember it. And so this process of talking about it, and I think maybe even especially as we've gotten more free in the way they're just conversations. So it's just, what are you personally bringing to this conversation? And we just talk about it. Versus something, maybe if it was more structured. Sorry, I lost that train.
That's all right. But I would say you kind of said something that I wanted to say, which is that I always find that I can appreciate a book more once we've talked about it, or I can better understand parts of it, or better, and like I said, the occasional books we don't like or we disagree on, I can better understand why I dislike it through the conversation. Whereas sometimes if I read something on my own and somebody asks me like, oh, what do you think of that? It's mostly a simple, oh, it's pretty good, or that's great. Or, there's very little engagement in what actually the opinion I have about the book. But like Nick said, having to have an opinion sometimes can be frustrating. I get, but
Mm-hmm.
I enjoy the conversations more than anything else.
Yeah, I'll also add another layer to this that we haven't chatted about yet, which is guests. Having guests is a very interesting experience for a million different reasons. But you may have noticed, if you've listened for a while, that there's been kind of various waves of styles of guests. At some point, it was sort of like, we're doing professors. And then it was like, we're doing musicians now. And now we've kind of settled out on things that maybe make more sense, which is writers. But one of the themes behind that is just people that appreciate literature. But when you're reading a thing and you know that you have a guest coming on and you have to think through what might be relevant to engage the guest, but you also don't totally know who this guest is, right? You can make assumptions based on, oh, it's a professor of blank, or for a lot of the musicians, I would try to find people that connected with books. But I would oftentimes find in real time that their takes on things would be very different than what I was pulling out in preparation. And so navigating that in real time is one aspect, but doing all that prep, especially if we're talking about professors who've been on, which, to share a little bit into where I come from, is I have no training whatsoever in literature. I'm an electrical engineer during the day. And that period probably came from, I can say now, having a chip on my shoulder and being like, I want to talk to people who know what they're talking about, and I want to see what their ideas are. I want to engage with the professionals. Let's see if this can work. But generally, having to sign up for that also meant that I would try to read as much as I possibly could to try to prep in all of these different directions, knowing that you had no idea where that conversation was going to go. And it always ended up being positive. Like, to David's point, you always came out appreciating more. But it definitely took me out of straight appreciation for reading and the joys of reading at various points, because sometimes I felt like I was signing myself up for a master's thesis every couple months and just like mainlining, like, oh shit, we have to talk about Samuel Beckett for somebody who's an Irish lit professor. Great. That's not hard. So there's, the forcing function, perhaps a theme, is something I'm into, but there's also a joy of reading that does not always line up with that.
What was the second question? Do you remember that?
What book takes you back to your childhood?
Or maybe what is a book you've read that took you back to your childhood? Ooh, I know. I have an answer.
Okay.
To me, it's like not my childhood. It's just the feeling of being a child, which we all were at one point. And that was Lispector Chandelier. Her descriptions of being a little girl. Admittedly, I've never been a little girl, but just that descriptions of that environment and that mindset and the relationship between children. I had forgotten the intensity of those relationships that you have with your peers. As an adult, you look at kids and it's like, oh, that's a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old. They're basically the same. That 4-year-old, that 5-year-old is basically an adult, and they know everything. And she does such an amazing job in that book of capturing what that feels like in this all-encompassing, almost like psychedelic way.
That was the first one that came to my mind. I can't think of another that we've... Is it something we've read for the podcast, or is it just something we've read in general?
Anything.
I think something you've read.
You define it.
Man, that's tough. Nick, do you have one?
Or is there a book that you've read that you read as a kid?
Yeah, I was going to answer it that way.
You reread as an adult?
Yeah, my unlocking literature book was Catch-22. I'm kind of due for a reread. I'm not the biggest rereader. I think I've only read it maybe 3 times. But I had somebody when I was in high school, like a English teacher, just hand me that, because I was probably just being an annoying kid, being like, I don't like any of this. And they're just like, read this, you'll like it. And begrudgingly, that kind of unlocked stuff. Like, wow, you can be this funny. You can be this sarcastic. You can be this on the nose. And, I do think in high school, when people are pretty open to stuff, a lot of our curriculums oftentimes ram the wrong things down our throats and turn us off to all sorts of stuff. And so I am happy I had that moment, because that kind of wasn't immediate, but it kind of set the seeds of how I spend a lot of my time and the thing that I enjoy the most. And so my answer is Catch-22. Also, the best book that Joseph Heller has written. A lot of them that he's written aren't very good, actually, it turns out. Something Happens dope. I'll stand up for that one.
Okay. That's interesting. If we're going high school teens, then I had a high school teacher give me Breakfast of Champions by Kurt Vonnegut, and it did the same thing for me. It was just such a insane, funny book that I need to read. I need to read more of this. And I think that same year, I also read Clockwork Orange.
Yeah.
It
That was a
just,
good time in high school. It's like when they introduce you to that level of books. It's like, oh,
yeah,
where
just
have you
like
been
opened
keeping
up
these?
the world to me. But like childhood books, I was a sucker. I read, a decent amount as a kid, not a huge amount, but the Neverending Story book, I don't know how old I was. I couldn't have been very old, maybe 7 or 8, maybe. I have no idea. But I must have read that book like 10 times in like 2 years, just over and over again. That was
If
a
you
big
would
one.
have kept reading it, you would have hit 1,000 by now.
Yeah, literally would have never ended.
Hey, this is Derek Main, episode 99, Laszlo. Love you guys, love the show. I've got a question today. This is one that I think is a lot of fun. What book did you love or espouse, you're a big fan of, but somehow it's grown dimmer in your mind only? So you haven't revisited it, but for whatever reason, 5 years, 10 years has gone by, and just the memory of it has faded to the point where maybe you question your earlier self and you think, was that book as great as I thought it was? Did that, was I too generous with my praise? Something like that. So any sort of work that maybe is dimmed a little bit, only in your mind, because I'm fascinated with the way that our memory of work changes the work even as we've left it unread for so many years. Really hope there's another 100 episodes. This kind of cultural work is so awesome, so important, and it fills a need. Thank you, guys. All right, bye.
So thank you, Derek. That is wonderful.
Yes, thank you.
And
Much
this
appreciated.
is a great follow-on to the previous question, actually, kind of from a slightly different angle.
Maybe they all hang out together.
Anything come to mind immediately, Nick?
I can go on this. So I'm going to vote Faulkner's Sound and Fury. So that book, I do think, as somebody who's just said I don't reread books, I keep referencing books that I think I've reread, but it has been a long time. And so reading The Sound and Fury, I think to me was kind of that unlocking of, call it modernism, or just a different way of writing. And so experiencing that for the first time led to all sorts of stuff, whether it gets into, I don't know, a lot of time that I spent with the classic Infinite Jests and Gravity's Rainbows, or, eventually later digging into Joyce and Beckett. It all, for me, the literal first book was Sound and the Fury. But I can't really remember a whole lot about it other than, the Benji chapter. But I remember having an edition where it had some commentary at the end from Faulkner. And there was something that stuck with me, which was that he tried to tell the same story over and over, because after he wrote it each time, he realized he had failed to live up to what the story was. So therefore, he had to write it again from a different perspective, and then write it again from a different perspective, because he was trying to get to that fundamental truth of what that story was supposed to be. And so I really can't remember a whole lot about what that story is, or even what's unique about Faulkner's prose. But I remember that concept, and that has really stuck with me. So I guess to tie together the concept of reading and memory, I pretty much always lose everything after a while, or recently after a very short period of time. I can't remember anything. I hear it only gets better. But that like concept, I think, is a thing that when I, look at my non-color coded bookshelves and I see that book, I go, oh, I remember that concept from the book. I don't remember anything of the characters or the plot. I remember like this thing that the author was getting at or a feeling from it. And so I think The Sound and the Fury is kind of the perfect example of that item for me.
Can I ask when you read it the first time?
Probably 19, I think. I used to read a lot in the summers in college because I didn't have, it was all engineering and math courses. So I was like, I'm going to read books in the summer. And I feel like it was probably like after freshman year, maybe, where it landed.
Do you feel like, do you suspect that if you read it today that you would have a similar feeling, or do you suspect that if you read it today, maybe it wouldn't have the impact it did the first time?
I think it might have a bigger impact, because one thing I've learned now, there's kind of splitting like your way of interacting with a book. Sometimes there's just like the direct, like the one-to-one visceral, like this is me and the book, and that's a very pure thing. But then there's also how this fits in within the broader arc of literature and aesthetics and, the whole concept of reading. And I feel like I'm too old, not that we're all that old, but I've read too much to have as much of that visceral impact, right? I have too much that I've gone through. So that latter category becomes more important and more powerful to me, is like figuring out the connections and understanding like, oh, wow, he really did this thing at this period in time and it was cool in this way. And I think that's a thing that, the classic, like your early years are heavy intelligence and like a lot of brain power. And then your later years are sort of wisdom and, being able to think in a more level-headed manner. I could sort of feel that happening within my reading behaviors too. So I think I'd probably even get more out of it.
There's a book that I was thinking about that I don't really hear people ever talk about, and I don't know where I found it, but I read it maybe 12, 15 years ago, and it's called The Dodecahedron, or A Frame for Frames. And it's a novel of these like strangely interconnected but also undermining narratives, and each one is like a different genre, different narrator, and it's called a novel, but it's kind of like a book of stories. And at the time, I remember loving it and trying to recommend other people reading it. And I still have it on my shelf and I occasionally think about it, but I don't really remember much of it at all, which is strange. But in my head, like, or in my gut, I guess, is really where it is. There's this feeling of like, that's a good book. More people should read this book. And yet, if you were to ask why, I couldn't really tell you at this point. It's just like this, the last ember of a fucking campfire of feeling just sitting there. Like, well, yeah, that's good. That's good. I know that's good. But I honestly can't remember much of it at all.
Are you worried that if you picked it up now, it might be just like unlistenable math rock? You're like, oh, why did I recommend this? Oh.
Yeah, it's like listening. Like, I used to like the Dillinger Escape Plan. Let's see what they sound like. Oh, I don't know about that.
First 2.5 records, I stand by, if anyone's listening.
Yeah, that's true. No, that's true.
But yeah, that's not sometimes these things are so impactful, but like if you take yourself out of like your exact mindset, you're like, oh my God, of course nobody would be into this.
Yeah.
I feel like I feel this way about most books that I read. I guess books that I personally really resonate with me when I read it. I think, Nick, what you said, I feel this. I feel it very similarly, but I feel like I've almost gone in the other direction. Not because you read books when you're, I don't know, in high school. They're trying to teach you about genres and movements or whatever. And it doesn't stick. And you said you read Catch-22, and it's like, boom. Now this is a book that resonates with me. For me, that book was 1984.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I can hardly say that now without feeling a little bit cliche. Of course, that book was 1984. But at the time, I hadn't read that. I hadn't read anything like that. And it blew my mind that they would let me read that book in high school. that they would encourage you to think about these things. That, I think there was some sex scenes in it. And I was like, oh my God, do they know this is in here? Has my teacher even read this book? And, it's one of those books I'm like, I kind of want to go back and reread it, but I kind of don't. I kind of don't really want to know what I would think about it now. And another book that kind of falls in that category too, for me is, although a little bit separate, but just a book that hit me personally was The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet by David Mitchell. And it's kind of a historical fiction. Historical fiction doesn't exactly, not a lot of critics are raving about historical fiction generally. It doesn't fit safely into a category of, oh, I'm safe to say that I like this book, as opposed to something like Proust or War and Peace. Like I could tell anybody, oh, I love War and Peace, and nobody's going to be like, oh, you're one of those. You sentimentalist, you like War and Peace. And so it's like, if a book can fit into that lattice work that you're talking about, okay, I understand where this falls in the category of the evolution of storytelling and why this is significant or not, then I'm kind of safer in saying that, or in recommending this book. But when it falls out of that and it just hits me personally, I'm like, I don't know where this falls in the history of literature. It just hits me. I think those are the ones that I'm like, I should probably be really sure of my opinion before I go around recommending that somebody read these books, or, admitting that it's, or calling it my favorite, let's say, or saying that it had the impact that it did.
Did you make me read The Bone Clocks?
Did I?
That book was garbage.
I did not like. I'm sorry, I didn't like that one either. Did I make you read that one?
No, I think I
recommend
read Cloud
that
Atlas because of you. Does that sound right?
That sounds right. I
Yeah.
did like
Cloud Atlas still holds up.
Yeah, that's a jam.
But it's been a
Bone
while.
Clocks was like, that's trash.
I didn't.
Yeah, his later stuff has really not been great.
Yeah.
I think Cloud Atlas is good. I think Ghost Written's pretty good.
Like
Maybe there's another
Black
one
Swan
in there.
Green.
Oh, Black Swan Green is
Yeah.
that's a great like coming of age novel. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah, Nathan, I know that feeling. There's books like that where Nick mentioned Tropic of Cancer, something that Nathan and I are going to read later next year, I guess, maybe. I read that, around the same time, like 18, 19, and loved it. And I sent me down a Henry Miller path where I became just trying to read everything I could.
Mm-hmm.
And I've since read his Rosy Crucifixion books at least twice, which I really like, but I haven't returned to the tropics in 2 decades, so I have no idea what they're going to be like.
I mean, isn't that kind of a beautiful feeling, though? I mean, it's kind of wonderful to read a book that you don't know where it falls. I think that's one thing I really like about reading authors that aren't from our literary canon, like they're translated from other countries or something. It's like, I don't know where what the aura around this author is. Like when we read Lispector, I didn't know anything about Lispector. If her writing is considered like cutting edge or, important, or if it's marginal or what. I went in blind and I was like, this is incredible. This is something else.
Yeah. That's a better feeling than having high expectations and realizing something's kind of shit, which I've already once made reference to. And then end with House of Leaves. That was another one where I loved it when I was young.
Wait, hold that thought.
Okay.
So I have no fucking idea who you people are, but you guys popped up on my feed, and I just wanted to let you know that you should read House of Leaves. I'm reading it right now, and it's really crazy. All right?
Oh, well, there you go.
There you go.
That's a book that I have a great deal of respect for and nostalgia for from when I read it when I was like 20 or maybe even younger, actually. I might have been in high school, I think, when I read it for the first time. And I had that same feeling that woman had, that it was creepy, and I loved it. And I read it again in college and wrote a paper on it and loved it. And then I read it for the third time when we did the podcast, and I was just kind of like, oh, all right. That's a lot of fireworks for not a lot of meat. I don't know. I'm mixing metaphors, but
There's not enough meat in these
fireworks?
fireworks.
It's a classic tradition. Meat fireworks.
yeah. I never made it to the States, I think, the meat fireworks. But
It's a Korean thing.
yeah. Yeah, that's a book that has gone down in my estimation, and I think deservedly so. But that's just my opinion, and that's a book that a lot of people, we don't, we get comments here and there. That's a book that people disagree with our opinions on quite a bit. They think we are idiots for not fully appreciating that novel.
I think for me, I think it's the book that's been recommended to me the most, just from randomly. It's like, oh, you have a book podcast? You should read House of Leaves.
And you're like, we already did episode blank.
Yeah. House of Leaves. Nick, you weren't even on that episode. Have you read House of Leaves?
I have not. And
you should read it.
Yeah, I know I should. But I mostly trust our averaged opinions on things. So the averaged opinion did not put it higher on my list. Probably put it lower.
I think it's a perfect book to read when you're late teens, early 20s. I don't know. Because especially if you've never been exposed to that kind of writing before, it really is something. But yeah.
I still like it. I actually liked it more the second time that I read it.
Did you? Okay.
Yeah.
So it was me, you, and Eric?
Eric. Yeah, Eric was on that
Okay.
one. And it was funny because we all had sort of a similar experience. We'd all read it before, and we all had sort of read it with this. It has an aura for sure, this book.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, oh, wow, I'm reading this really crazy, cool book. And we all went in the first time reading it, and the second time through, we're reading it for the podcast. It's kind of just a different context to be reading it. And I still liked it. I still find it to be a particularly creepy. I like the way he makes it creepy.
I mean, it's still a good book. It's just it definitely lost some of that aura, and it's not a book I'll purge either. So even though I'm a book purger, I'm gonna keep it because
it's a book object.
Like it is. It's an object, and it's something I think I will flip through, or maybe look at, or maybe think about reading again. And yeah, now that I'm having a child, I feel like there's certain books I'd like to pass down. Like, okay, you should read this.
So
okay,
yeah.
Try to do a few more. Yeah.
Shorter questions. I think we're gonna make it.
Long-time reader, first-time caller. I wanted to ask about the play within the book in Thomas Pynchon's Crying of Lot 49. Why do you think Pynchon approached that part of the book using an imaginary Jacobean revenge play? Excited to hear your answer. Thanks again for putting this show together, and congratulations on the 100th episode.
Thank you for calling in, and
giving us a very specific.
You just called in to make us look like we don't know what we're talking about, didn't you?
Yeah. Well, this kind of goes back to Derek's question about memory. I don't remember.
Yeah.
I want to know what's a Jacobean revenge play.
Wait, did you not read that book?
I read it,
Nathan.
I didn't read it for the podcast.
Okay.
I read it years ago.
Okay.
And
so it's even fresher in your head.
Even super fresh. As fresh as the kimchi in the back of my vegetable drawer.
I didn't know where that was going. Trunk, back of the car.
That would have been yeah. It's in
to ferment.
Yeah. But man, kimchi, when you forget about it, you crack it open. Oh, throw that out.
No, you got to make jjigae with it, man. The more sour it is, that's the whole purpose.
Yeah, when it starts getting that fuzzy stuff on top,
you scrape, you toss.
Yeah. Pair it with some meat fireworks.
Yeah. Honestly, you pair anything with some meat fireworks.
Okay, back to the question. What do we think?
David, I know that you've got strong opinions about this.
I mean, so those kind of tragedies and plays, a lot of them were written at a certain time period to talk about corruption and violence and things going on in higher societies and how. So I would say, like, I think there's that part of it. I don't really remember it. I think it's called the Courier's Tragedy, and I think
That sounds
Pynchon
right.
sort of uses it as a way to deepen the conspiracy of Tristero. And he loves putting on theater. So like I just finished Gravity's Rainbow, and Pynchon loves the idea of putting on a show to obscure reality. And I think that definitely plays a part of it. But these are vague recollections of a book that I mean, what a specific question. This dude's killing me here. Maybe Nick, you got a better memory than I do.
I would. So I did read that recently, but did not record that episode, which means that I read the book for joy, not for scholarly purposes. But I guess what I will say, hearing that question, is Pynchon to me is an interesting entity. There's lots of opinions in various directions, but to me, he's fundamentally a pop author. I know there's a bunch of books that he has that are crazy complicated, and so maybe he's the most complicated pop author. But if you go throughout his collection of books, I feel like he does similar things with different mediums as you get through the different timeline of Pynchon. And so Gravity's Rainbow is what, like 1960 or something?
73 is when it was written or published.
Really? Oh, it's way off. My memory's great.
I think this one was late 60s, second half of the 60s.
Okay.
For Crying Out Loud 49.
Yeah. So to me, it's just kind of, in addition to your comments, David, about how it's this like specific formal category of how news was delivered previously, it also sort of fits into, in my opinion, like the accessible media within like the development of Pynchon's own timeline. I'm not saying everybody was going to Jacobean revenge plays in the 60s. But, it's before he got super into, like, say, bleeding edge internet stuff, or super before he got into Vineland, like punk band stuff. Like, he was kind of just figuring out what these different forms were that were available to deliver. And again, like him or not, he definitely did that way more than other people. Because I think he just didn't give a shit about what the forms were supposed to be. Because he's a pop author, right? Mm. And that's what made him great.
I think Crying of Lot 49 also talks about and hints at, and there's like a certain amount of fear over the future ways in which we will communicate now. And it's part of the reason why the underground mail system exists. So I think part of using that form of play is to kind of go back to look at older forms of communication and as a way of relaying things that are important, because as the future becomes more and more controlled by things outside of your control, you might have to revert back to older ways of communicating. And also, it's funny as shit. So I think there's, I think Pynchon,
that's it.
Ultimately, as a comedic writer, I think that's a huge part of it.
Yeah, I stand by that as category 1.
So, Nathan, now your opinion?
Yeah.
From 21 years ago.
I agree. I couldn't have said it better myself.
All right, moving on.
Am I recording? The beep just beeped. Honestly, hey, congratulations, you guys. Honestly, I am maybe not the only person, but definitely one of the people who never, ever thought that this was going to go beyond 1 or 2. So congratulations on your perseverance, your persistence, and your punctuality in how that applies to Pioneer Podcast. I should have gone with podcast. 3 Ps, alliteration for 3 literary dudes who read books. Thank you for being an inspiration to other people who want to do things. Good job.
That sounded incredibly sarcastic and demeaning. Good job for not giving up after only 2 or 3 episodes. Because like me, and not just me, all of the people I know thought you wouldn't make it this far.
People are talking. Well, I guess there's no question.
Yeah. Just thank you for the backhanded stab.
Positive reinforcement.
Yeah. Or I gotta say that you're gonna have to endure more of these episodes. This isn't the end. Anonymous caller. We're not giving up.
Nick, Nathan, David, Seth here from Waste Mailing List. I'm calling today to congratulate you all on your 100th episode of Boss and to thank you for nearly 8 years of exceptional literary discourse. It's been a while and the details are, I'll admit, a little bit slippery. I can't actually remember how I found your show. What I can say definitively is that I started listening in early 2019 when I saw an episode titled, and I think I've got this right, A Miserable Pulp of Decay. Anyhow, this was the discussion that brought to my attention an author who I now affectionately refer to as the Dark Wizard of Hungarian literary fiction, Laszlo Krasznahorkai. Since picking up Shut and Tango and your recommendation, I've now read a half dozen other novels by him and have a further half dozen waiting on the shelf. And this is really just a small sample of what's been introduced to me thanks to the show, which I'm always pleased to see pop up in my feed when a new episode drops. You three, with an assortment of fantastic guests, have always managed to foster substantive, thought-provoking commentary on the books you cover, and that's while still maintaining a casual, conversant atmosphere. Now, that might sound like a throwaway compliment, but I'm actually of the opinion that it's more difficult to do that than we often give credit for. Consider that my roundabout way of saying you make something that isn't easy look easy, which is part of why I'll continue listening for as long as you guys keep putting out shows. As a sporadic content creator myself, I know that it's much harder to maintain consistency than it is to start a creative project, which would explain why 90% of podcasts never see it through to the 4th episode. So consider that my way of saying, I hope the three of you recognize what you've achieved by making it to 100. Nick, I'll be sad to see you go. Nathan and David, please keep up the great work. I'll end this on a question. What's a book that each of you have read that to this day you don't know how to feel about it? Maybe you're not sure why you like it. Maybe you don't understand it. Whatever. Tell me. I'm curious. Cheers, guys.
Thank you for all of that. That was
amazing.
That was eloquent and also excellent speaking voice. Anybody want to jump in on this answer to this question? Book that you don't know how you feel about it.
I'm going to go with one that might be a hot topic, but Godspeed game, Hessa. I'm just tossing a softball to Nathan right now.
Well, yeah, I'm gonna hit that one out of the park.
To me, that is probably the book that is conceptually the coolest, but the reading experience is the least coolest. And I think that is fascinating because not all Hesse books are terrible to read. You know, some of them pull themselves along, some of them are gripping. So I do think it's intent there. But I find myself thinking about that one. And it's also one of the more popular, episodes we've done. Just it's a book that people out there are also thinking about. It pulls lots of opinions. People love discussing it. But I still can't figure out, because I generally at this point believe that like doing things aesthetically is cool. Playing around with how easy or hard a thing should be is cool. But at some level, your vehicle for delivering information is still competing with the rest of entertainment. So like the most boring way of delivering your story possible is not helping, but somehow it's still insanely popular despite that. So I find myself thinking about that from time to time. And even though I'm sure if we go back and listen to that episode, we're raving about it because it has such awesome conceptual content, but I still don't know if I'm like, yeah, that's the best, because of that reading experience is so insanely flat. So it's one that percolates in there. And I'll also just close by saying, thank you, Seth. Those are really nice words. I appreciate it. your episodes have also been good. So keep doing it.
Yeah, I think Nick picked the exact perfect book, and I think actually on the episode we talk about that very same thing, that we don't know how to feel about it by the end of it. Yeah, that is a book that I think about a lot, and I'm like, oh, maybe I'll read that one again. I kind of pick it up. I'm like, maybe not.
Well,
maybe not.
Just into the fire it goes.
And because I think every few months, somebody, speaking of Nick's hate of the internet, which we talked about earlier, every couple of months
we'll
someone
one of the two
gets online and just says Hess is such an overrated author. He's only for high school students, blah, 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 blah. And I'm always like, the Glass Bead Game, maybe there's something there. And it's something that just, constantly pops up into my head.
I feel the same way about Glass Bead Game, actually. And I think about it a lot also. I'm like, maybe that's the Glass Bead Game. That's what he's talking about. That's the Glass Bead Game. The internet's the Glass Bead Game. AI is the Glass Bead Game. Oh, we're all just players of the Glass Bead Game now. Because I do think that it's such a strange book. And I wanted to read that book for so long, and I did not enjoy it. I didn't enjoy the reading experience. It's so boring. But the idea, it's like the idea is stuck in my head more than maybe any other concept that I read in literature. And it's because it keeps coming up. It's like he foresaw, and maybe this was happening at the time, that everybody was becoming generalists, or like you just had to be able to move the pieces around. You don't actually know how to do the thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know how to paint. You just know how painters are related to each other, or how that painting is associated with this music and associated with that technology or whatever. But nobody knows how to make music or paint anymore. And I feel like, wow, isn't that where we're headed right now? Anyway.
Yeah. Just get the robots to do it, man.
Yeah. And we just have to know how to talk to the robots and give them the right glass beads.
That's what we're learning in high school now. Just put it into ChatGPT.
And I think the other book is maybe House of Leaves, and we've already talked about this one, because it kind of similarly, like it can be a drag to get through. And I know there's a million ways that you can read it. I confess I did not read every single annotation in that book, and maybe I'd have a different opinion if I did, but who's got time for that? But it affects me in certain ways, but there's some parts of it that I feel like are overwrought. It's another book that I think about quite a lot, just, in a different way. But last question. We just got one more.
One more?
One more.
Is there only one more?
Only one more.
Okay. I feel like there was quite a few more.
There's definitely more.
There's definitely more.
Did you ask your AI to download that for you?
These are all AI generated questions. I don't know if we covered that. Just kidding. Maybe. Thank you for everybody who took the effort to dial a number on the phone.
What book would you recommend to someone who hates reading?
What book would you recommend to someone who hates reading? I'd recommend a picture book. I love picture books.
I don't think that was the essence of the question.
Oh.
But maybe not. I'm going to say, because my answer to a book that took me back to my childhood was somebody handing me a copy of Catch-22 because I hated reading, that I would now hand copies of Catch-22 to people. So I'm going to segue that and just link those two questions because it worked for me, therefore it must work for everyone. Also, Catch-22's dope.
I mean, I would say I'm going to answer this question a little bit of a roundabout way, but like there's so many books out there, and books are communicating something. It's not a chore to read. It's a beautiful thing to read a book. And if you're not getting it, if it's not working for you, put it down, pick up another book, because you're going to find that Catch-22 or 1984 or whatever it is. That's just going to, and then you're going to want to look for that again. And that's the reading journey. I mean, I think for this podcast, thanks to Nick and David, but especially Nick, I think you bring in a lot of books that I would not have otherwise probably have picked up. Some of them I liked, some of them I didn't. And, I think making that effort too, to fully engage with a book, and not just literature, just fully engage with something. And a book is something that you can carry in your pocket, have by your bed, and pick it up and fully engage with it. And it will, a lot of the books that we've read, it will reward you for fully engaging with it. It's not always easy. And maybe that's the next step after you read 1984 or Catch 22 or whatever that book is that turns you on.
And if you read it in public, people will think you're smart.
Which is why we're doing this.
I think you said it well, Nathan. Thank you.
So the answer is Catch 22.
Nick was right once again.
I feel like we can't end this without acknowledging that Nick is departing. I feel like people know, but...
Yeah.
There we go. It's like a retirement party.
Yeah.
There we go. So, I don't know, Nick, if you want to say something to people.
Yeah. I guess, some background. So, Boss is cool. It will continue to be cool. I've obviously spent a ton of time reading and prepping and planning, and the amount of mind space on any given day is finite, and some of that was for Boss every day in some way, shape, or form. And there's a couple things going into, basically calling it good at 100, which is that mind space is finite. It definitely competes with various other things in my life, family time being a major one. The other piece of it kind of talked about a little bit more, which is reading for a specific thing versus reading for joy. And I'm interested in that joy spot, or following where the tea leaves take me in terms of which book, because that's where a lot of these things came from. But oftentimes we would, at least I personally would, cut short a thought branch to hop onto the next thing without really following a thing to the end. And I truly thought of this like a day or two ago when, Jan Fosse was announced for the Nobel Prize. And I was like, see, fucking, we said so. That guy's amazing. And that was like the first time I ever felt like invested in that, because, 6 months ago, that was a branch that I started going down. I was like, this is incredible. This is now one of my favorite authors. But I had to like cut off that branch to get to the next thing. So I'm interested in just like open-ended, like I can follow that to the end without competing time, without competing, slots of life. And then I think the other thing, which we were talking about before we started recording, David, you alluded to, but I just hate the internet. And it makes me unhappy. And I think we all know this collectively as a society. Like, the Surgeon General put out a thing saying that the internet, social media, is the current pandemic. It's the worst thing. Like, you should turn off all of this, go outside and smoke a cigarette, and you'll be healthier. Like, that's basically what the message was. And I kind of feel that every day. Obviously, it's part of our jobs. It's part of everything that we do now. But the times that I've figured out ways to minimize it have been rewarding doubly, because then it also frees up the thought space, to sit with a book or to just follow those thought branches. And getting older, have less and less open-ended time. And so part of it is just maximizing that time that exists, while also admitting that if I'm on the internet, I'm addicted to bad feelings. And I don't like it. Sometimes I like it. Sometimes it's amazing. But I think it's an attempt to, oddly enough, for a podcast that's about reading, it's about trying to read more at the end of the day. So here we are. But keep going on the internet, because if you weren't going on the internet, no one would listen to this podcast. So like all good drug dealers, you basically have to stop using your own stash while promoting it. Maybe we cut that.
Yeah. Or, I mean, if the stash is books and you're just becoming a full-time user, you're just getting out of the dealing game.
That's true.
Yeah.
I just want time to come down.
Yeah.
I don't know if this analogy is working.
Yeah.
As you can tell, I don't really do drugs. I just watch movies about it.
Well, Nick, I mean, we built this together, but you put in so much work on this, and it's really it's been your brainchild in a lot of ways. Bringing in the guests and really organizing and making sure that we show up on time and remember even today. I was like, what time is this podcast?
What time are we recording?
So I have loved all of this. I've loved reading the books. I've really loved the conversations. I think that having these structured conversations about books with you guys has been, one of the best things about the last 8 years, really. It's been awesome. So I'm going to miss you. I'm going to miss having these conversations. We just got to figure out a way to have these conversations without recording them on the internet. But I can't guarantee I won't be recording them. So
we'll just go outside and smoke cigarettes while we talk. Because apparently that's my formal recommendation. Yeah, and I'll close by saying that I'm pretty sure there's going to be a void of this style of conversation in my life, because despite what you might read on the internet, which again I hate, where everybody seems to gang up on books and authors and movements, I go about my whole life without meeting anybody who's read a book. It's not full of people out there who have all read Infinite Jest and think it's amazing. Nobody in real life has read Infinite Jest. It's okay if you like it. It's totally fine. So I do kind of expect that's going to be a gap, and we'll see if there's an opportunity to occasionally refill that gap.
Nick was a heavy reader, his mind a library. Started a book club and podcast, his love for books was legendary. But when he retired, the world lost its light. Like a star in the sky, he left us in the night.
That's right. That was the internet. That was a gift for Nick from the internet.
And was that did you pay a human through a gig site for that?
That was
or is that
all
entirely
computer.
Robot?
That was all robot.
Wow. And here I am taking time off from boss to spend time making music, and that's worthless now. Y'all ready for this? That's what it is. Jock Jams Volume 1.
Jock Jams.
Maybe 2.
There's
Turn
the
off
beep.
that noise.
What is
It's-
happening?
I don't know.
There's a joke in here somewhere.